So I'm here today with Sheila and Lorraine. Tell me again what the title of your book is.
A Northern Gardener's Guide to Native Plants and Pollinators, creating habitat in the Northeast, Great Lakes, and Upper Midwest. So that's the geographic focus for the book.
So let's start with that. Why did you choose that geographic focus?
It kind of made sense ecologically in terms of the kind of ranges of native plants and the similarities of habitat. Ecologically, it made sense. And Sheila, maybe you can speak about why it made sense in terms of the particular bee species. But ecologically, just to sort of not attempt to include everything, like not go down into the southern ecological regions of the US or over to the west where, there are different bee species, different plant species, along with having a lot of kind of general information about pollinators that is relevant anywhere.
Lorraine and I have been working in the general region, Great Lakes region, Southern Ontario for many, many years now. So we also were, relying on our expertise for a lot of things and our own knowledge that we've built up over the years. We did focus a little bit on the rusty patch bumblebee, which is the first bee that was listed as endangered species in both Canada and the US. And that species occurs in Southern Ontario and then down into the Northeast and into the Midwest, not too far south. It kind of follows the Appalachian Mountains a little bit into the south. But that species was a very common species and became very rare just over a couple decades. So it's kind of our canary in the coal mine, a story that we use to bring people in to talk about wild pollinators and how quickly they can disappear if we don't take care of them.
Canary in the coal mine is one of our favorite terms at CFS. We use it here. So how did you guys meet and how did you come together to write this book?
Actually, Sheila, I think I first heard about your work when you were a graduate student at York, and I think maybe I might have even interviewed you and written about your work when you were a graduate student. I've just always admired Sheila's work so much, the rigor of it, the commitment. Of your work. And so I've been writing about native plants for a long time, but coming together around really focusing on the specialist and the intricate and, incredibly, in some cases, complex co-evolved relationships between native plants and insects, in particular bees. It just made sense for the two of us to to collaborate.
Yeah, and Lorraine has been talking about native gardens well before it was cool. So I think both of us are similar in that sense. We talk about maybe ideas before they become mainstream and have been, calling out misconceptions, even though it, is sometimes a little bit unpopular to disagree with maybe large NGOs or what have you. So we also bond over that kind of thing.
Our rebellious bond.
So tell me more about that, disagreeing with big NGOs. What are some disagreements you've gotten into?
For me, there was a lot of focus on honeybee declines. The honeybee, the European honeybee, is one of the most common insects in the world. You can order it in the mail. It's invasive in many countries outside of its natural range. There are issues with beekeeping and hive loss due to exposure with pesticides and weather and a bunch of things. But that's more of like a monetary issue, and I'm a conservation biologist. So when people confuse an industry management problem with a conservation issue, that kind of gets under my skin a little bit, even though I know both things are, important. But we had a few NGOs really pushing the whole like honeybees are endangered narrative, which is untrue. In fact, I think there are more hives in Canada now than there were 20 years ago. There hasn't been a recent study on that, but some of the studies in the past years show that actually beekeeping is, especially in cities, is actually increasing. So that's one example. There have been many that come up that we're constantly kind of fighting against a little bit.
And in terms of native plants, some of the misconceptions that I think are out there in terms of gardening, it's not so much in my work, I don't encounter it so much with NGOs, but maybe gardening groups or the gardening media, just sort of being or promoting an idea that, well, as long as it's green, any plant is going to serve some crucial ecological function, or be good for pollinators or really support pollinators. And that's just not the case. We know of the importance of these co-evolved relationships that native plants um, have with native insects. So it's not just a matter of, oh, you can substitute one plant for another and still have the same benefits. So that's really where I see a misconception out there, certainly in the gardening world.
Yeah, I reading the book, I was thinking a lot about the relationship between the monarchs and how the caterpillar's only food is the milkweed. And we don't talk about how that's, if I'm saying this correctly, that's their only food.
Certainly in their larval stage,
Yeah.
yes, exactly. The caterpillars depend, for the monarchs anyway, um, depend on milkweed species, and there are a variety of different milkweed species. Um, but yeah, there's this relationship of dependence. Yeah.
And so how frequent are these specialty relationships between the pollinator and the native species?
They're by far the norm. Especially if we're talking about butterflies and moths, those host plant relationships for the caterpillars. It's absolutely the norm. The exception is when, let's say in the example of black swallowtails, for example, that have adapted to, their larvae have adapted to eating now introduced plants like dill and parsley, that were introduced by the colonists. But that is the exception. For the most part, it's native plants that the butterflies and moths, so Lepidoptera, depend on. And then maybe Sheila, you could talk about the bees and
Yeah,
their
I
dependence.
actually don't remember offhand, Lorraine. Do you remember? I feel like it's about a little bit less than a quarter are specialist bees, but maybe I'm off on that.
Yeah, anywhere from a quarter in the Northeast to a third
Okay.
in central US. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's not the majority, and maybe some people have like issues around that. But as a conservation scientist, my goal is to keep as many species as possible. So we're interested in those rare specialist relationships. We want to keep everyone in the ecosystem, not just the common and abundant things.
And I do think it's just not very well known out there. And again, Sheila, when you were speaking about, all of the focus on the honeybee, like that leads, those misconceptions actually have like consequences around people's understanding of the diverse needs of native bees and the different life cycles of native bees. So this idea, that or the fact that at least a quarter, and in some places more, of the native bees are actually pollen specialists and require the pollen of specific native plants in order to rear their young. So the next generation depends on that. I just don't think that's very well known, because all of the focus has been on, honeybees that live in hives and, all of those kind of unusual aspects of the honeybee.
Yeah,
Yeah, exactly. So living in hives, making honey, stinging, dying after you sting, even being yellow and like stripy yellow, these are all things that most of our bees are not. But it's what we think of when we think of bees. So, most of our bees are metallic silver green. Most of our bees live in the ground. Most of our bees are solitary. Many of our bees don't sting. Many of our bees are not yellow and black. Some of them are green. Some of them are blue. Some of them are orange. Yeah, bumblebees don't die when they sting. They can sting you over and over again if they wanted to. Usually they just, go away, get out as soon as they can. But yeah, that's only honeybees that do that. And the whole making honey, like our native bees sleep over the winter. They don't need to store food. So honeybees store honey so they can stay awake over the winter. So they take way more resources, pollen and nectar out of the ecosystem than native bees do, because they're also storing food for the season where our native bees are sleeping.
Mhm. Something I found really interesting in reading the book was thinking about everything from a very anthropocentric lens, and also thinking about the role that honeybees play in industrial agriculture. And so I'm curious if you have any more comments on that, or if you want to expand on that concept at all. Because I just think that honeybees have so much visibility, probably because we depend on them in terms of helping turn food around for humans. But I'd be interested in your overall perspective about that.
Yeah, I think it's an important conversation. I think I've heard Lorraine say this in talks before, but humans, at least, I don't know, settler societies maybe really have this desire to control and manage the environment. And honeybees might be a really good example of that, where we know a crop needs pollination. So let's breed these animals and figure out how we can get many of them and bring them to the places where we need them, and then they'll pollinate and then we'll have the food. And it just seems so linear. But the reality is, when there are studies that look at what's doing the pollination in these crops, often the solitary bees are more efficient and more effective than the honeybees that, those paid pollination services. When you look at how colony collapse disorder and varroa mite came in and just wiped a whole bunch of hives out, it's pretty risky for us to depend just on one managed species. Whereas if we have, in Canada, we have 865 native species. If we keep all of those species in the system, then maybe, a drought, a new disease, an ice storm in the spring, maybe we'll still have pollinators, like, despite those stressors coming in. So yeah, it's really, really risky, and people don't really appreciate that part of it. And they think that honeybees can just replace native bees. And then we have a whole bunch of crops that honeybees are just awful at pollinating, to be frank. Like anything that needs buzz pollination, tomatoes, eggplants, some berries, these things need bees that know how to buzz pollinate. So some solitary bees, some leafcutter bees, and bumblebees can buzz pollinate, but honeybees are not able to. And that means they grab on to the flower and vibrate at a certain frequency, and only then is the pollen released. So yeah, we definitely need to start thinking about all of these other players in our food systems, because it's super risky to just think that we can manage a species, manage two species, and get what we need out of them.
Yeah, especially in the context of climate change and the fact that these stressors are just going to be increasing, and the idea of having such a vulnerable monoculture dependence, not only in the crops, but also in terms of the pollination of honey, the services of honeybees. You could not set yourself up for more risk of failure than what we have done with the industrial agriculture system.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think what I found so appealing about the book was that you laid out all of these issues and these misconceptions, and then you provide this amazing tool with so much detail and so many different factors to consider in terms of how anybody can start a little native plant garden to support pollinators. And so I'm wondering, was that the intention of the book, essentially, was to empower people to understand that you can do this small thing? It's not that difficult. It's pretty empowering, and it's a climate change tool.
Yes, but also to with a hope, and I think a realistic hope that that kind of small scale action will actually lead to and empower you with some tools to go even bigger. And I don't just mean, like bigger in terms of, the area that you are restoring habitat to, but making other connections too, like to policy and to the action, the political action that has to be done, and making those connections in the agricultural system. I'm hoping, I don't, I think it's realistic to be hopeful that when people are planting native plants, seeing the life that those, and seeing the relationships, seeing more birds, seeing more butterflies, seeing more bees, that it will lead to more action.
And in today's age of like, how many character limits that Twitter has or hashtag use on Instagram, and just there's so many oversimplifications of stories and solutions that we run into in our field, like that go flow beehive to help the honeybees or save the dandelions, or all these like sort of catchy short solutions. I think one of the main goals of our book was also to sort of just show people that there's a lot of complexity out there, and in fact we don't even remotely understand the complexity yet. We're just beginning to understand some of these relationships and consequences and things. So to just sort of take our lead from nature and not try to manage it, not try to reduce it down. I think that was one of the main goals too. So just to sort of be humbled and acknowledge that we're still learning, but we can do what we can with what, with what is supposed to be here, what the native plants in your area.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Sheila, when we talked before, you told me a little bit about misconceptions related to dandelions. Could you go into that a little bit?
Yeah, I just was kind of thrown off a little bit at how, I guess in the UK, they had this No Mow May campaign that really took off. People really care about bees there. There's a culture of protecting bees that maybe it's a little bit newer in North America. But one of their campaign sort of slogans was No Mow May. And the idea was that you let those early spring flowers that crop up on your yard to just bloom, because that's the first food. And it is true that when bees come out of their overwintering sites, they are very hungry. They've lived off of their fat bodies for the whole winter. They didn't have food like honeybees. So they are definitely on the verge of starvation. So those early spring food sources are very important. But what we see in cities and other places, if you're not really paying attention, is you see crocuses, daffodils, dandelions, snowdrops. And these are all things that were brought here. They're European plants. They're not actual signs of spring. They are signs of spring in Europe. Our signs of spring are pussy willows. They're shrubs. They're in the trees. They're spring ephemerals in the forest floor. So yeah, our native bees haven't co-evolved with what people think of as signs of spring, and if they're not really learning too much about these things. So the dandelion in particular is problematic to me because we know that the pollen has very low protein, maybe almost no protein available. And queen bumblebees, for example, need a lot of protein before they start laying eggs. And there was one study that fed bumblebee queens dandelion, something from the prunus family, and a willow pollen, I believe. And with only dandelion pollen, the queens started eating their own eggs, which meant they had no offspring because they were so pollen deprived. So these aren't like, if you see a bee on a dandelion, you think it's good for it, but the reality is it could be hindering that bee's ability to lay eggs, which is a very important part of the colony cycle. Also, dandelion pollen can disrupt the pollination of native plants that are around it. It's a very successful invader for that reason. So there's things happening on the microscopic level that we cannot observe, but they're happening. And that's why dandelion is such an amazing invader. And that's why we see it everywhere. And that's why we think it's now a sign of spring. And it is delicious. And I encourage people to eat it because it is very good to eat. But to promote it as some way to like help save the bees from extinction is just incorrect, in my opinion.
Yeah, fascinating. Yeah, thank you for sharing. I think a lot of people do not know that at all. Another thing I'd love to just cover really quickly, and maybe Lorraine, this is a question for you, is for people who want to buy native plants, just what are the barriers to that? And why why is using non-native plants just ineffectual overall?
Yeah, so there are some barriers in that the nursery industry is, full to overflowing with non-native introduced plants, including plants that are very invasive in natural areas. A number of common and popular garden plants that are sold by nurseries can escape from the wild and really or escape from the garden into the wild and reduce biodiversity. So I really, I think it's important. And in the book, we encourage people to purchase native plants or to share native plants or to propagate them, from seed ourselves. But if you're going to be purchasing them, to buy them from specialty native plant nurseries, and these exist across North America, but they are certainly less common than, regular traditional garden centers that are selling mainly non-native plants. Luckily, though, there are a number of great organizations, nonprofits that provide information about where to find a native plant nursery. So groups like Homegrown National Park or the National Wildlife Federation or Lady Bird
North
Johnson
American Plant Society, the
Yeah,
North American Native Plant Society. Yeah.
yeah, and they have tools on their websites about how you can find out what plants are native to your area, where you can find a native plant nursery. Almost every state has a native plant society. So although there are some barriers to it being as easy as it is to find non-native plants in a garden center, it is definitely um, much easier than ever before to find this information, to find sources of plants, to find other people who can help with, information and resources and inspiration and talks and newsletters, and where to find these plants. And many of these native plant societies hold sales, and offer native plants at a much reduced price. So although there's, although it's a bit less easy than finding non-native plants at a nursery, finding native plants and information is getting easier all the time because of some wonderful nonprofit organizations.
Yeah, it just takes a little bit of research.
Yeah, the lowest bar, literally Google native plants and the name of your state, and you will immediately find like such a great starting place in the Native Plant Society for your state, which often have chapters that are local, so to your specific area.
And we
Yeah.
do have some things listed in the book as well,
Yeah.
Yes.
some resources.
Lots of.
Yes, absolutely. We have a lot. Yeah, I've just, I just mentioned a couple of the organizations there, but in the book we've included, as Sheila just mentioned, we've included a lot of other really great resources for information and for plants.
Well, and so we talked about pollinators specific relationships, but just in general, just so that our listeners understand, why is using cultivars and non-native plants just overall not really good for pollinators?
Using native plants is so important in terms of supporting the co-evolved relationships, but that have co-evolved over like a very long time. Um, these co-evolved relationships between native plants and insects, and specifically the pollinators that are so important to all ecosystem functioning. These relationships can't just simply be replaced with any green plant, a plant that, let's say, has been introduced since colonization, for example, and has not uh, evolved to support. They haven't co-evolved in terms of mutual support and providing the resources that pollinators need.
Yeah, awesome. Sheila, is there anything else you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know too much about the horticultural industry, but from what I understand, a lot of the plants are bred to be showy, to bloom longer, to be more colorful, to have more dense petals. Like you can think of like roses. If you know, those prize roses versus wild roses, like they look completely different, right? So when you lose those things, you lose, bees lose their ability to like smell the flower, which is how they find them. Or they might lose the UV coloration that they use to as a nectar guide. A lot of flowers kind of indicate where the bee needs to go to get to the nectar. Some no longer produce pollen, some no longer produce nectar, some are just really complicated to get into, like those really frilly roses. Whereas otherwise, they'd like wild roses are just open and the bee can easily find the anthers. So there's a lot of things that just like regardless of the co-evolutionary relationships, they also just like are very difficult for for insects to figure out. So we're just doing them a little bit of a favor, making it a little bit easier for them also to just kind of give them what they're used to and hope for the best.
Awesome. I just wanted to make sure that was really emphasized so that people understand why this book is so valuable and such an important resource. So thank you so much to you both. And thank you for your time and for explaining the book. And I think it's a fantastic resource for anybody who wants to garden and support pollinators responsibly. Is there anything either of you want to end with?
Just thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks so much. This was fun.